There is a piece of Missouri that most Missourians have never been to, and most couldn't explain on a map. It hangs off the bottom of the state like something left behind. It is a narrow rectangular protrusion that pushes south into Arkansas, shaped exactly like the heel of a boot. It sits closer to Memphis than to St. Louis. It looks nothing like the Ozarks to its west or the rolling farmland to its north. The people who live there will tell you, sometimes with a laugh and sometimes without, that they live in Arkansas. Just the Arkansas that never got the paperwork sorted out. The Missouri Bootheel covers roughly 2,000 square miles and contains some of the most fertile agricultural land in the entire state. The soil is extraordinarily rich. Deep alluvial deposits left behind by the ancient Mississippi River, built up over millions of years of flooding and sediment. Cotton grows here, rice grows here, soybeans grow here on a scale that supplies markets across the country. The land produces enormous quantities of food, and yet the people who live on it are among the poorest in Missouri. Population has been falling for decades. Towns that once had thousands of residents now have hundreds. Counties that were growing in the early 20th century have been shrinking ever since mechanization arrived and have never stopped. The richest dirt in the state sits underneath some of its most persistent poverty. The question of why starts not with economics, but with geography, and specifically with a single decision made by a single man more than 200 years ago. When Congress was drawing the borders of the new state of Missouri in 1818, the line was supposed to follow the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel straight across, the same line that separates Kentucky from Tennessee. That would have placed the entire Bootheel area inside Arkansas territory. Clean line, simple geometry, logical division. John Hardiman Walker didn't want that. Walker was a planter who had settled in what is now Pemiscot County around 1810, just before the earthquakes. By 1818, he reportedly owned several thousand acres and a large herd of cattle, a substantial operation on land that technically sat below the proposed state line. Walker lobbied aggressively to move the border south, arguing that his area had more economic and social ties to Missouri than to Arkansas. Congress accepted the modified boundary in 1820. The Bootheel stayed in Missouri, and with it came everything the Bootheel would become, a region that was geographically, culturally, and economically southern, attached to a Midwestern state that never quite knew what to do with it. Area residents have their own phrase for the arrangement. They call it Arkansas in denial. The earthquakes Walker survived were among the most powerful ever recorded in North American history, and they helped define the land he fought to keep in Missouri. The new Madrid seismic zone, named for the Bootheel city that sits above it, runs beneath the region in all directions and crosses 5 state lines. In the winter of 1811 and 1812, a series of earthquakes along this fault struck with a violence that reshaped the physical landscape. Eyewitnesses described great fissures opening in the earth, geysers shooting mud and rock hundreds of feet into the air, new ridges rising from flat ground, and the Mississippi River running red with sulfur and sediment. The February 1812 earthquake is believed to have been felt across the entire eastern half of North America. Church bells rang in cities along the East Coast from the force of it. The Mississippi River appeared to reverse its flow. On the Tennessee side, the ground subsided so dramatically that water flooded in and created Reelfoot Lake, a body of water that had not existed the day before. That fault is still there. It is still active. Small tremors occur regularly. Geologists have noted for decades that the new Madrid seismic zone is overdue for a significant event, and that the infrastructure in the Mississippi Valley, including bridges, pipelines, and buildings, is not built to the standards that would survive a repeat of 1811 and 1812. The Bootheel sits directly on top of it. Before the early 20th century, most of the Bootheel was not farmland at all. It was swamp, dense, impassable wetland, rich in wildlife and timber, but unsuitable for the kind of large-scale agriculture that planters and investors wanted to build. Between 1905 and the 1920s, the Little River Drainage District undertook one of the most extensive land reclamation projects in Missouri history. An elaborate network of ditches, canals, and levees was cut across the lowlands, draining the swamps and converting the former wetland into flat, open agricultural fields. Millions of acres that had been impenetrable marsh became tillable ground almost overnight. The people who built that drainage system and then farmed that land were not the people who were owned. Cotton moved into the Bootheel in force after the boll weevil devastated the crop in Arkansas in the early 1900s. Planters from the Deep South bought up the newly drained land and established cotton operations that looked functionally like the plantation system of the antebellum South, transplanted north by a few decades. Sharecroppers, both black and white, worked land they did not own in exchange for a share of the crop that rarely covered what they owed the landowner for supplies, housing, and equipment. Debt kept workers tied to land they could never buy. The system was designed to stay that way. By the 1930s, the Great Depression had collapsed cotton prices, and the New Deal's Agricultural Adjustment Act was paying landowners to reduce their acreage. The checks were supposed to be shared with sharecroppers. Many landowners kept them entirely and evicted their tenants to avoid the requirement. Families who had worked the same land for years were turned out in January. It was the coldest month, the emptiest calendar, the moment when there was nowhere to go. On the night of January 9, 1939, an African-American minister and labor organizer named Owen Whitfield organized something that had never been done before in Missouri. He told 1,500 sharecroppers and their families, black and white together. This was one of the first integrated economic protests in American history. He told them to carry their belongings to the shoulder of U.S. highways 60 and 61 and sit down. Not to march, not to demand entry anywhere, just to be visible, in public, on the side of a road, so that the country driving past could not pretend they did not exist. "Take your eyes out of the sky," Whitfield had told them, "because someone is stealing your bread." They camped there in the January cold. The American Red Cross refused to help, calling it a man-made disaster. State authorities eventually forced them off the roads. But the photographs taken by St. Louis Post-Dispatch photographer Arthur Whitman ran in newspapers across the country. The images, families huddled in the frozen Bootheel beside piles of furniture and children wrapped in blankets, embarrassed the state and forced a federal response. The Farm Security Administration built 10 settlements across the Bootheel, the Delmo homes, providing housing for more than 600 displaced families. The protesters bought 93 acres of land and named it Cropperville. They built a school and a church and survived. The demonstration was one of the most consequential labor protests in Missouri history. Most Missourians have never heard of it. The mechanization of cotton harvesting in the 1950s and the 1960s finished what the Depression had started. When mechanical harvesters arrived in force, the labor that sharecroppers had provided became largely unnecessary. One local historian estimated that Pemiscot County alone lost roughly 85% of its population in the decades following mechanization. The workers who left in enormous numbers went north to St. Louis, Chicago, and Detroit, feeding the Great Migration and draining the Bootheel of the people who had built it. The towns contracted. The businesses that served those workers closed. The banks that served those businesses followed. What remained was the land and the machines to work it, and far fewer people than there had been. This channel runs on subscribers. If you haven't hit subscribe and the notification bell yet, take 10 seconds and do it now. There is more of this coming from across the region, and you will want to be there for it. Depopulation has not stopped. From 2010 to 2020, the combined Bootheel counties lost roughly 7.5% of their population. Dunklin County fell by 11.5%. Pemiscot County fell by 9.2%. The median age across the region is climbing as young people leave and older residents remain. The towns that still exist are smaller than they were a generation ago, and smaller still than the generation before that. The poverty numbers are not incidental, they are structural. Pemiscot County consistently ranks among the poorest counties in Missouri, with median household incomes well below both the state and national averages. The region as a whole sits at the bottom of Missouri's economic rankings on nearly every measure: income, educational attainment, healthcare access, and life expectancy. The same counties that produce enormous quantities of food grow that food using machinery operated by a handful of workers and owned by corporate agricultural interests that are often headquartered far from the Bootheel itself. There is something else in the soil. Cancer incidence rates in several Bootheel counties exceed the Missouri state average, in some places significantly. Epidemiologists have identified associations between elevated cancer rates and the intensive pesticide application that intensive row crop agriculture requires. The Bootheel has some of the highest pesticide application per square mile of any region in the state. The land that was drained, cleared, and converted to agriculture a century ago is productive in ways that have consequences the original drainage engineers never accounted for. The new Madrid fault runs underneath all of it. Geologists describe the seismic zone as not a matter of if, but when. The infrastructure along the Mississippi corridor was not designed for a repeat of the events from 1811 to 1812. The Bootheel, the region closest to the epicenter of that event, has the fewest resources to absorb it, and yet people stay. The Bootheel has a culture that is entirely its own, shaped more by Memphis and the Mississippi Delta than by anything north of Cape Girardeau. The blues tradition that runs through this land, the church life, the food culture, the particular speech and humor of people who have watched the rest of the state look through them for generations, none of that is nothing. The people who remain know what this place is and what it has survived. They know about the sharecroppers on the highway in January 1939, even if the rest of Missouri has forgotten. They know about the earthquakes that made the river run backwards, even if the seismic engineers in St. Louis and Kansas City spend their careers trying not to think too hard about what comes next. What the Bootheel has is what it has always had: extraordinarily rich soil that produces wealth for people who don't live here. A history of labor that built a region while getting almost none of what it built. A geography that is southern in every meaningful sense except the official one. And a fault line underneath it that has been quiet long enough that most people have stopped worrying about it. The fault does not care if you have stopped worrying. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, do it now. This channel covers the parts of this region that do not make the brochures. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment. Have you been to the Bootheel? Do you live there? Because the people who actually live in a place always know things the maps do not show.